So I hope that you'll excuse the fact that this presentation will be in English. As soon as Brexit was announced, I did get dual citizenship, but I still feel more comfortable presenting in English today. I'm going to take you through some very tangible use cases that are happening right now today at Bayer in our pharmaceutical division, where we're using artificial intelligence, and by that I mean machine learning, computer vision, types of machine learning like deep learning, to solve some of the most severe problems that we're facing in trying to develop new medicines to get the right medication to the right patient at the right time. So the demand for global healthcare, that's not surprising for anyone in this room. We all know here in Germany and in other European countries what demand is being driven by our aging population, by our improved understanding of chronic disorders that we're facing in oncology, in cardiovascular care, our increasing understanding of preventative measures we can take to reduce the overall cost and burden of healthcare. And we also see the world population continuing to grow in all of the developing nations around the world, added to the aging populations here in Europe. These figures are on the screen. I mean, you can look at them yourselves, and they're not going to be surprising to the sort of people who would attend a conference of this nature. We know these numbers, we know that pressing burden, we know how much it's going to cost, not just our taxes, but the future costs for our children. And I'm certainly aware as a parent about what it's going to mean for my daughter growing up in Germany. So my background is in molecular oncology, so cancer research. I've worked in several different disease areas, and then worked as a data scientist, so specializing in machine learning and different forms of machine learning. At the end, I'm happy to take questions if anyone wants to get technical. But what can you do with software that you can't necessarily do with a pill? And the fact is that the cost of producing medications is astronomical. So right now, from the beginning of research all the way through to a launch on the market, we're talking about 2.6 billion American dollars for the average medication in development by a pharmaceutical company. If I can improve your outcome through the use of software, and I can produce something along the lines of a digital therapeutic or a more efficient research and development pipeline for our existing medications, then I can significantly reduce that time, that cost, and that burden before the medication reaches the patient successfully. And also with software, with scaling up software in the form of digital therapeutics, I can deploy it more quickly to remote patients who currently don't have easy access to healthcare, and deploy it more quickly and scale up very rapidly. So the numbers here around the amount of data we can produce are for all different types of data. So why do we think about real world data, as we call it within the pharmaceutical industry? When we're trying to develop a new medication, we're not only looking at all of the data points we have in our really controlled clinical trials, where we're trying to measure and regulate every aspect of what a patient's experiencing, but also through pharmacovigilance, we're understanding what does that medication and that patient's journey look like when they're not in one of our controlled trials. When they're at home and they're sitting in front of their box of medications, and they perhaps have to take 20 different concomitant medications in a different sequence throughout the month just to remain healthy, just to remain fit. When some days they're eating a very strict diet, and other days they decide to indulge and have an additional glass of wine. What can we find out in the real world now through wearable devices, through social media, through other forms where they choose to input their data and make it available to a healthcare provider about how their experience with healthcare and medication is affecting their individual outcomes? So this is a new opportunity in the space of machine learning. I have heard, of course, at the talks and at all conferences, and certainly in my day-to-day work, a lot of discussion around patient privacy. That's something we take very, very seriously at Bayer, particularly being in a heavily regulated industry like pharma. Today I won't cover in a lot of depth how we de-identify data and ensure that it's never aggregated and put in the same spot where it would then put the patient's individual and private data at risk. Something we work very hard to ensure doesn't happen. But again, there will be time for Q&A on that if that's interesting for anyone at the end. So what I really wanted to do today was to try and get away from these beautiful high-level slides and take you through some examples in earlier detection of disease in oncology and in stroke and heart failure, in the faster development of new medicine. So I wanted to show you some of the technologies we're introducing in our research labs and in our clinical development, and then in precision medicine. And that's what I alluded to there briefly before. That's when I say for you, the individual, what sort of combination of therapies and treatments is your body with your lifestyle, your genetics, going to best respond to, and how can we make that precision medicine then available to you in an affordable way? So together with the UK have the National Health Service. The National Health Service did something I think very, very exciting, very innovative. They supported the startup of a company called Senzyme. The NHS now continue to own 4% of Senzyme, and we were the first pharmaceutical, in fact are currently the only pharmaceutical company that Senzyme are collaborating with in the field of R&D, and we work together with them on stroke and heart failure prevention. They currently have access to the longitudinal data covering 20 years of 2 NHS hospital trusts in the south of England. So we then don't have direct access to that patient data, and as someone who has a lot of family in England, I'm quite happy about that. I don't think we should have access to that personal data, but we have access to then go in their secure environment, which is in Cambridge, to then use de-identified data sets to create simulations of patient populations in a very secure environment. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we use that data for. So the first work package we agreed with them was on cohort definition. What does that mean? It means that when we run a clinical trial, and we say who should be in that clinical trial, in the end we're thinking about what will be the label on the medication when it's released, when it's sold. And we want to make sure that that medication is going to the people who will best benefit from that medication, that you have the right description on the label for who should be treated, who will have the best outcome. And a lot of our medication is based on similar medicines that have been developed in the past, where we know something about the molecular structure, about the behavior of those medicines. So by looking how patients have already responded to other treatments, and by looking at how different variables in their lifestyle and genetics, and also the quality of care they get, depending on what country they're in, affects their outcomes, we're able to design clinical studies to include those patients who will respond most favorably to the drugs that we're developing, so that when we eventually produce our label, we can be very precise about which patient group will most benefit from that treatment. The next part, which is really around, maybe let's combine a few. Really there, we're looking at heart failure and stroke, and the part about the 20 years of data here is really critical. So we don't want to come in after somebody's had a stroke. I'm sure a lot of you here have experienced that, either through friends, through relatives. I know my own grandmother had a stroke. I know what that looks like after a person's had a severe stroke. That's not the point that we're targeting with this investigation. We're trying to say, what can I see in your electronic medical records before you have that severe stroke that will let me know this is an early point where an intervention, where some sort of preventative treatment can stop that stroke occurring. Why would the NHS be interested in doing this with us? Well, for them, this is a massive reduction in the burden of cost for healthcare, if then they can have preventative treatments before a person has a debilitating serious cardiac event. And for us, this is an area where we really want to target with new treatments, with new therapeutics, with new medications, the preventative, the early care pathway. And finally, I'll just go on to the virtual clinical trials. So if you're at pharmaceutical conferences or at regulatory conferences, you'll hear this over and over again. In some ways, we already do this when we're having studies in children, so pediatric investigations. We're not allowed to go into children with anything less than a dose which is having an effect on that child. So if a child registers into a clinical trial, we don't give them a dose which is below efficacious, below what will have an effect on their disease. We always start off with a dose where it's going to take effect. And how do we predict that dose if we've never tested this medicine in children before? And the way we do that is we use in silico models, modeling and simulation, to then predict based on the adult data what we think will be the optimum dosing to give to children based on other past studies where we've also run similar medications in children and seen how they then respond. We're highly incentivized to do this because you can have patent extensions when you take an existing medication and make it available to children. But it's also for us, I mean, it's an ethical responsibility, and I don't think it's a hard one to relate to. Who in this room would want to go into children with a medication where you weren't confident that you were going to see an improvement in their severe disease? So if we look then at the role of artificial intelligence in diagnosis, we here particularly focused on a rare mutation, the NTRK gene fusion. I'll promise not to go too much into the oncology background, but it's a rare mutation. It's a fairly rare mutation, but it's found in many, many different solid tumors. So if you are a lung cancer patient, and you go into your doctor's office, there is a 1 in 300 chance that you have this mutation. So all you know is you have lung cancer, you have a solid tumor, you want to treat it. But if you have the NTRK gene fusion, and then you're treated with the medication larotrectinib, so Vitrecvi is the brand name, then you have a very high probability of having a reduction in your tumor size and an increase in your overall survival rate. But if you come into your oncologist's office and he looks at you and he sends your sample away for sequencing with the most common mutations, you don't have one of the most common mutations. How does he find out that you have the NTRK gene fusion? That there's a drug out there that could be highly beneficial, highly impactful for your solid tumor. How can he then transfer you to that correct treatment? So what we do is develop an algorithm based on the HE images, so pathology images, which are taken as standard for all patients with solid tumors. And we use computer vision, so the same sort of technology that Google's using with their self-driving car, to then learn from these images and to then be able to sort, does this patient have that mutation or not? What does it mean for clinical practice? It means your oncologist, and this is now what we're aiming for. So right now we just have a high-performing algorithm. We have nothing deployed in the clinics, but we want something where a doctor can then have an alert. This patient has a very high likelihood of having that mutation, and then please sequence that sample. It's an expensive sequencing test. It costs €5,000, but they have a very high likelihood that they're going to have that mutation, and therefore a very high likelihood that they will respond favorably to a treatment that's already available. And so that's what we're moving into, which is really then, how do you use this artificial intelligence in clinical decision support, and in a way where the control still sits with the patient and their treating physician, so that physician knows how to use that technology, feels comfortable with understanding and interpreting the recommendations it gives. And the patient can then have a conversation with their doctor, their trusted advisor, about, based on this new piece of information, which is in the end all the artificial intelligence can give you, what sort of treatment regime do we as two human beings talking to each other currently decide for us would be the best one to pursue? And here you can see some of those images from the gene fusion mutation that we've currently trained our model on. Right now we're focusing on thyroid cancer, and in the next phase of the project we're expanding to lung. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this 2.6 billion for drug development. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of years, right? It's a lot of years before something hits the market, and in the meantime those are untreated patients or suboptimally treated patients. So how can we tackle that? What we also use our technology for is creating efficiency within the value chain. And this is one of the approaches we take. It's really based in the lab, and I'm very proud of this one because my team worked on this. And they're using IoT and also quality assurance through machine learning to optimize the drug discovery process in research. Why do I like this one so much? Well, very basically, it makes things more safe and more controlled and more efficient for the researcher in the lab. So I used to be in the lab myself, and what we can do now is make everything from not having to touch with your hands all the different surfaces in the lab, but being able to automate as much of that process as possible, creating environments where you're not constantly having to write in a paper book everything you've been doing, but you can automatically have very accurate notes of your research being taken, voice to text. You can then integrate that internationally across thousands and thousands of different researchers working on the same projects, easily share very accurate results. I know that when I was in the lab, we had then Excel dumps from our laboratory equipment. Now you can immediately have a solution in the background that will integrate all of that raw data set. Nobody can manipulate it. You can immediately share it, and you have reduced the burden of work on your researcher, who can now focus on the things they were trained to do at university, which is how to develop the best medicines and solve the problems that I have at hand. So that's one of our efficiency projects, and here you can see some of the panels that our researchers here, even in our Berlin Wedding site, are now able to use on their tablets in our small molecule facilities there. And at the same time, this reaches out to how do we run our clinical studies to have an increased efficiency. It's several things. So it's one, how do you be most cost effective, but it's also how do you give information to your patient. So when we are starting to use tablets of this sort and also create apps for patients in our clinical studies that they can use, they can watch videos to get their information on informed consent. They can start to see videos that explain to them exactly what's going to happen at every stage of the trial, to remind them when they take their medication. More and more, it allows them to do things at home, so they don't have the inconvenience of traveling into a hospital site to take part in one of our controlled clinical studies. And it allows us, again, to make sure that the data is captured in the most precise and uncorruptible form possible, and as many different raw data points as we can. So we have a study that we just started up in Hong Kong and Singapore with MeadowPad, and there we're using the smartphone throughout the whole of the study to collect 1,000 different parameters about the patient, including what is their gait, what are their waking times, what are their body temperatures. And that's a complex thing, and we have an obligation as a pharmaceutical company to make sure that every patient who chooses to participate in that study fully understands what data is collected, how it is used, and that's why we start to use media through our apps to try and explain that process as clearly and efficiently to our patients as possible, and also to give them the capacity to chat with our central monitoring centres and doctors in case they have follow-up questions or anything wasn't 100% clear to them. So in the end, I'm sure we have quite a strong IT audience here, and we will have time for follow-up questions, but this is the solution that we use in the end, and it's for us all about IT security. So IT security, data protection, and preserving the anonymization of the patient's data throughout that entire flow. Here, this is now the last example I wanted to cover today, and it tackles patients with chronic and peripheral arterial disease. What we wanted to look at in this study was, again, how do we get to these patients and how do we get them onto the right treatments, which are our blood thinning agents, before they have their serious cardiac event. And in addition, if you're adding a blood thinning agent and using that as a treatment, how do we identify the patients who, because of specific genetic parameters or specific lifestyle parameters, might have a high risk of bleeding, and therefore that treatment wouldn't be appropriate for them, and they should be kept off that treatment. So in this study, we used a series of claims databases from the United States, and were able to, from that approach and from those data sets, create an algorithm which would then predict which patients with these two disorders would most benefit from treatment with one of our drugs, Xarelto, which is on the market. One, because they would have a lower risk of adverse events, such as increased bleeding, and two, because they would have an improved chance at a reduction in their probability of having a serious cardiac event downstream. So I hope that the few examples I've chosen today give you a flavor of the research and the applications of machine learning that we have at Bayer at the moment. It's really something that allows us to tackle a series of problems. So efficiency of the current drug discovery and clinical development process, but also to completely change the paradigm of healthcare and look for preventative solutions, to look for software-based solutions that can be deployed in addition to medicines to overall improve the outcomes for patients. This change in how we work and what our product offering is at Bayer also means that we have to change how we view ourselves as a company, how we work together as a company. So what does that mean? Yesterday I was at Data Natives and looking to recruit data scientists. I spend a lot of my time doing that, working to recruit the best data scientists, try and attract them here in Berlin or to Leverkusen, going to universities in the area and encouraging people to really pursue the field of machine learning and data science, where there are a lot of attractive jobs in banking and in finance, and then improving advertising at Zalando, but trying to attract them to our mission statement here in healthcare. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are doing the same. So it's also about how we fund our resources. So we have to make sure that when we're saying, do I run this phase 3 study at a cost of X million? Or do I decide I'm going to instead develop a digital therapeutic, that in the end we're able to balance that out and say, well, what's the most beneficial product offering we could give to a patient that will give them the most improved outcome, and make a business decision looking across that portfolio of medicinal and digital products. And in the end, clearly communicate our vision and plan. So I hope I've been able to give you a little bit of insight today into what that is. And you'll see certainly Bayer at a lot of conferences starting to talk about how we're moving increasingly into the digital space, building on what is not 156 years of data, but certainly decades of data that we have as a resource as an old pharmaceutical company, and how we're able to transform that into an asset which gives us a huge advantage in this new digital world. So take-home messages for today would be then that we're really embracing data science and what that means across our entire portfolio. I could have just as easily today shown you some of our machine learning projects in the commercial and product supply space. Our clarity on the opportunities that are out there, and they're certainly significant. And I hope that you've seen from what we're doing in the oncology and cardiovascular space, this can be something highly impactful for the general population. And I think when we look at the way the investments of institutions like the NHS are going, we can see that reflected. The execution, so it's certainly not enough to talk about it, but it has to be deployed with real patient groups. That oncology algorithm that we developed, we did it with the Oreo Biobank in Finland, and at least during the whole stage of development, they were able to make it part of their process of looking at and treating patients at risk of the enteric gene fusion. And then building on the capabilities we need. So I talked about already our recruitment efforts here across the whole of Germany, trying to attract people to come to work in data science and healthcare together with us. And it's not just in Bayer. So what we're really building up is an ecosystem of partnerships with different companies globally who can help us achieve our long-term roadmap and vision for digital healthcare products. That is our last part, which is our efforts to energize our talent and our partners so that we can jointly start to solve the issues that we're facing in healthcare today. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention during the presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Möller, for your presentation. It was a pleasure.